Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Good? Good. Okay, good. So this is the third play-by-play conference that I've been privileged enough to talk at, and it's got me thinking. In fact, you could say it's gotten me feeling a little nostalgic. So with that brilliant segue, I would like to introduce my talk, Gaming Nostalgia, a Voyage of Fantasies. As the title suggests, we're going to be looking at nostalgia in games, but more importantly, how it is made, how it is used, and what it means. Now, this talk won't be about self-referential nostalgia. I'm not interested in games that make you feel nostalgic about older games. Instead, I want to take a broader academic look at the study of nostalgia, its applicability to games, and how we can use it to analyze our medium. But before all of that, who is this person standing before all of you? I'm Victoria Smith. I call myself an artist, mainly. On the screen are some words that you might associate with me. By day, I'm a production artist at Pickpock, right here in Wellington. My last game I worked on there was Into the Dead 2, which you can play at the exhibit. And I also make a lot of UI-related things. I love fashion and horror and history. I might be best known for talking about fashion in games at the last play-by-play, and also at PAX Australia last year. That was a lot of fun. And that last word there, cybertwee, if you don't know what that means, we'll get to it later. At the bottom right of my slides is my Twitter name. If you have any thoughts on nostalgia or fashion or anything, feel free to tweet them to me. So, nostalgia. I feel like everyone here has a pretty good idea of what nostalgia is, or at least what we generally accept it to mean these days. But nostalgia has some interesting roots, so I'm going to do a very quick overview before we go on. You may know that it comes from the Greek word nostos, which means homecoming. Pretty straightforward, nostalgia feels like home. It's a return to something from the past. It's like a big, warm hug. It's tied to your identity, your sense of place, and your history. What you may not know is the second part of the word, and the reason why it was coined in the first place. The second half of nostalgia comes from the Greek word algos, which means pain. Nostalgia wasn't even really much of a concept until a 17th century medical student coined the term. He used it to describe the very real and very painful anxieties that Swiss mercenaries felt fighting away from their mountainous homeland. From the very beginning, nostalgia has been about pain, which we'll get back to later. And then there is the modern nostalgia. I lovingly and sweetly call this the hey, remember this type of nostalgia. You may see something from your childhood in the 80s and you go, ah, my nostalgia, and a single tear rolls down your cheek. And then you go back to whatever you were doing and BuzzFeed gets some more ad revenue off you. This sort of shallow nostalgia is all over the media today. And I'm not going to name any names, but Ready Player One, that sure is a book and a movie now. This is the sort of nostalgia that we think about when I say nostalgia, but it barely scratches the surface. The academic study of nostalgia is a relatively young field. Much of it stems from Marc Lesueur's 1977 essay, Anatomy of Nostalgia Films, Heritage and Methods. As the media we produce, and particularly films, continue to aggressively look back at past times, more notice was taken in the academic world. Academic study of nostalgia generally splits things into cycles. There is the 20-year cycle, the 30-year cycle, the 40-year cycle. It doesn't matter which one you really want to adhere to, but it's generally a case of people in times of discontent looking back to when things were perceived to be more prosperous or peaceful. Games, on the whole, are a bit too young for this sort of thing, but we have the extremely convenient structure of hardware cycles to use as a framework for our nostalgia: 8-bit, 16-bit, early 3D graphics, flash games, and so on. Nostalgia comes in waves, and each new creatively mature generation is looking back into their own history to draw from. So now that we know what it is, we can look at how nostalgia is used in existing media. This will give us a good overview of how nostalgia can work before we get into specific details and putting it into games. Now, nostalgia in media, it can roughly be divided into three types: restorative, reflective, and deconstructive. They're all pretty self-explanatory once you know them, but let's explore them together. In her book, The Future of Nostalgia, Svetlana Boym defines restorative nostalgia as putting the emphasis on the nostos part of nostalgia. Restorative nostalgia is affirming. It's about returning to some sort of home or a better place. This is the type of nostalgia that romanticizes the past, the good old wholesome 50s or the free love era of the 1960s. Some very quick examples of this are the fun poodle skirts and milkshake antics in the 1950s and Back to the Future. Almost everything Bruno Mars has done lately, he's covered the 70s, 80s, and 90s and musical throwbacks. A lot of media right now references the over-the-top fun and retro-futurism of the 1980s. Films like Thor Ragnarok and games like Hotline Miami take all the cool bits of the 80s and mash them together. Restorative nostalgia in media is a fun ride, with all of the cliches and references that give us the feels. Reflective nostalgia puts emphasis on the algos part of nostalgia, the pain and the longing. Reflective nostalgia looks back wistfully on the past. It can often be reconstructive, wanting to live moments that have already happened. Reflective nostalgia can also involve more introspection. It can question why we latch onto certain things in the past and what the passage of time means for our development as individuals and as a society. Some examples of this are Stranger Things and its self-aware construction of a 1980s that we want to have existed. The recent film Lady Bird is a dreamlike look at the director's teenagerhood in the 2000s. Another example of the style of escapist nostalgia are the Fallout games and its lingering, loving renditions of the ruins of a mythic 1950s consumer culture. A general fascination with abandoned and ruined places, theme parks, hospitals, they're all part of this reflective nostalgia. Now, deconstructive nostalgia was not an original type pioneered by Svetlana Boym, but instead a more modern category, reflecting the changing nature of nostalgic media. Instead of being reaffirming or reflective of the past, deconstructive nostalgia is critical of the past and the emphasis or the values that we place there. If the media is set in the past, it can have some fun nostalgic elements, sure, but the theme or narrative of deconstructive nostalgia looks with a critical eye. Now, fun examples of deconstructive nostalgia is a little bit harder, but I'd argue they're becoming more and more prevalent with the self-reflection and greater contextual awareness that we have from our massively interconnected media. The new IT movie doesn't really create a fun picture of the 80s, but instead it explores the paranoia around stranger danger and other things from the time period. The Iron Giant is another film that does this. Its version of the 1950s is rife with anxieties about the Cold War and communism. The American Dream is an Australian VR game that has you solving everyday tasks in a 1950s nuclear family with guns, contrasting the sweetness of the suburban family with the horrors of gun violence. Mafia 3 is set in the tail end of the 1960s, and it doesn't hold back in its display of racism, poverty, and crime that is a far cry from the swinging 60s that we remember. These three broad types of nostalgia cover most of what we see in media. You might have noticed that a lot of these examples I showed were nostalgic for the 1950s or the 1980s, due to the 30-year cycle that I mentioned earlier. Nostalgia can be used in many different ways and for many different purposes, but it's nearly always to provide a lens to look at the present with. This may be lamenting the loss of something or the past that was better than today. It could be reflecting on what's changed, or it could revere what was cool back then. Nostalgia can draw parallels with what is happening now, or it can make us question our own past experiences. Nostalgia is a tool that can bolster the narrative, theme, and play experience of a game. Now that we've laid the groundwork for how to talk about nostalgia, let's look at how to actually make nostalgia, how to actually put it into our games. I'd argue there are two main ways to do this, through craft and through style. Style is the really easy one. It's probably what you think of when you picture anything nostalgic in media. Crafting nostalgia through style is the act of evoking nostalgia within the aesthetics of the text. If it's a film, this might be having all your actors wear 1970s fashion, or it could be a film grain effect. Any stylistic choice, be it set design, post-production, cinematography, can be used to evoke nostalgia about a certain time. In games, we have the same thing. A particular art direction or a certain use of assets in your game can create stylistic nostalgia. Our good friend Cuphead here is an excellent example of this. The main reason its style stands out is because it perfectly apes the 1930s animation style from so many years ago. Even if we personally have no nostalgia for that time period, the collective nostalgia surrounding that particular aesthetic choice still evokes similar nostalgic feelings. Other games that create nostalgia through style are Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon's cyber hyperreality of 1980s electronics and mass media. Gone Home explores the average American home in the 1990s with some teen girl riot angst thrown in for good measure. Emily is Away styles itself as a pixelated 2000s operating system, complete with MSN Messenger. And Sunset's 1970s bachelor pad was modeled off examples from issues of Playboy magazines from the time and real-life celebrity houses. Nostalgic aesthetics can be used to reflect a game's theme, give it a stronger sense of time and place, and to stand out from the crowd. The second way we can evoke nostalgia is through craft. Whereas style in nostalgia is created through superficial aesthetics, craft is the actual process of making the thing. Going back to film again as a really easy example, some directors shoot on 35 or 70mm film. While this could be for aesthetic purposes, there is still a nostalgic element to using film versus shooting digitally. And it doesn't just have to be physical production pipeline stuff either. Using nostalgic structural elements can work as well. Films these days don't have intermissions, so when a director does use an intermission as a structural element, it stands out. Applying this to games is a little trickier than applying stylistic nostalgia to games. Games are already incredibly complicated to make, and deliberately incorporating obsolete technology and methods is kind of a do-it-at-your-own-risk thing. There are some games that have explored this, though. Shovel Knight is a notable example. This game is a love letter to Nintendo Entertainment System platformers and similar games from the early 1980s. The developers deliberately limited themselves to a much smaller color palette and animation count to mimic the hardware of the time. They also used a lot of tricks to get the most out of their self-imposed limitations. They did make a few caveats, and the game itself won't actually run on original hardware, but they tried their best to stay true to the constraints of the time. By doing this, they created a game that has nostalgia built into its very core, and it shapes the entire experience of the player. Examples of crafted nostalgia are much less common than stylistic nostalgia, but they are out there if you look. Alien Isolation uses 1970s CRT screens that play actual video and Betamax footage. The developers transferred their video files onto the old tech, distorted them, and then re-imported them back into the game. Mario Combat is a recent game released for the Nintendo Virtual Boy, which was a 1995 game console so bad it was discontinued after less than a year. And yes, the player is shooting Bowser with a shotgun in that screenshot. Even early 3D graphics get some love. Band Memories has PS1 era graphics and is made in a game engine that doesn't even have a 3D editor. Adding nostalgia through craft doesn't have to mean adding it in the process either. Ukulele has many structural elements that are generally considered to be outdated, such as the quiz show interlude shown here. This type of nostalgia obviously has a lot of crossover with stylistic nostalgia, and usually leans much more on self-referential than global or collective. Using nostalgic elements in the very process of making a game can lend an air of authenticity to it. It can almost wind the clock back and bring back what we've forgotten within reach. So how have I used nostalgia in my own work? The game I'm working on has the very inspiring title of Unfinished Chat Game. It is a narrative vignette game set on the internet of 2009. Most of the story is told through instant messaging and digging through various blogs and websites. Why 2009? Well, since this is somewhat inspired by a true story and it's kind of based on the actual timeline of my life, the mid to late 2000s also seem to have been on everyone's mind at the moment. When Windows Live Messenger closed down last year, it felt like it was part of a larger cultural zeitgeist, looking back on the 2000s and how they've suddenly, inexplicably become the past to us. All of a sudden, it's 2018 and 2005 was not 10 years ago. Untitled Chat Game takes place inside a fake operating system, and it's mostly modeled after early versions of Windows XP. Video games have a well-documented love affair with fake operating systems. After all, they run on one, and all art eventually reaches the point where it examines its own medium. Operating systems are a space waiting to be manipulated, and our familiarity and expectations of them makes them a perfect vehicle for whatever the game is trying to tell us. Lots of operating systems are restorative in their execution of nostalgia. I feel like you see this most often in earlier DOS-era systems. They're the same consoles and chunky black and white font that you might expect, but they're sleeker and cooler and easier to navigate. The nostalgic element to these kinds of operating systems is going to remind you of when you were a kid, discovering the possibility and power of a computer and the control you have over it for the first time, at least for a little while. Restorative nostalgic operating systems tend not to draw attention to themselves. The operating system is simply a way to interact with the game. It's the form that the UI takes. The game isn't going to say much about the past that it's referencing because that's not where its focus lies. Other operating systems are reflective in their use of nostalgia. This is where we start to see narrative and design call attention to the operating system and its temporal location. In many of these cases, the game is the operating system. The player is tasked with exploring the UI to learn more about narrative clues, to better understand characters, or to find new parts of the game. In games that deal in reflective nostalgia, the lens is turned inward to the guts of the software that's powering it. While restorative nostalgia may be more particular about recreation and authenticity of fake operating systems, reflective nostalgia is where we start to see it take stylistic liberties. Operating systems become less about pure recreation and more about evoking the right tone to support the narrative. They're still recognizably tied to a time and place, but they're allowed to grow outside of that. Now, there aren't many operating systems that deal in deconstructive nostalgia. This is a trope usually found in horror games, like Pony Island there. These operating systems have no interest in authenticity or in self-indulgent recreations. They don't want to reflect on the past so much as they want to take it apart into discrete pieces and ask questions about why all this is happening, and then probably make you cry or something. By taking apart the very fabric of the game, the software it's running on, they create a game space that is unnerving and without any clear boundaries. We're so familiar with these operating systems because we use them all day, every day. So when we see each piece picked apart and scattered like entrails after a bear attack, it makes us very uncomfortable. Without a safe place to hide, the player is forced to question their reality of the game and the relationship they have to the bit of nostalgia that is in front of them. At the moment at least, Untitled Chat Game lies somewhere between reflective and deconstructive nostalgia. Much of my inspiration came from the very calming, feminine operating systems of Sibel and LostMemories.net, but the game also has a bit of a bitter, cynical edge. And now we're going to talk about Vaporwave. First, a very quick history of Vaporwave for those of you who might not know it already. Vaporwave started as an ironic joke subgenre of electronic music that used smooth jazz and elevator music along with distorted and chopped up samples and recordings. In short, it was memes. The cover art for these fake but also real albums was a really weird mix of glitch art, 1990s web design, and classical high art, along with nostalgic and pop culture references. Vaporwave also spawned a whole bunch of subgenres of its own and also influenced Cybertwee. Cybertwee is the name of an art collective and movement that was started in 2014 by Gabriella Heilman, Violet Forrest, and May Weaver. Their manifesto proposed a feminine, romantic, and cute intersection of technology that was equally as powerful as the masculine and gritty cyber future that we were all promised. The phrase Cybertwee has since been used to describe the defiantly feminine and the unabashedly pink in technology and games. And what does all this have to do with nostalgia? The Vaporwave and Cybertwee aesthetics both draw from the same well of 1990s and early 2000s technology nostalgia that Untitled Chat Game does. By juxtaposing trash glitch art and early 3D of a cyber future that never lived up to its promises with the high classical art of the past and the empty pop culture icons, they alienate the mundane and familiar and create a slightly uncomfortable space. Looking at these screenshots from the game, it's recognizably Windows XP. I followed the same style lines in the original Windows XP UI, the chunkier rounded buttons, the barely there outlines and drop shadows on everything, and the use of gradients. But it's a cute Windows XP. It's pink and it's purple and it looks a bit like an alien landscape. It's a fever dream of an operating system. It's inviting enough that you want to explore it and to stay and look around a while. By giving players enough of a guiding light with their familiarity with the real Windows XP operating system, but with its visual approach being ever so slightly off, it invites reflective nostalgia. Most of the game is spent digging around on blogs and websites and in folders, the hazy past of trying to find information amongst half-broken links and locked LiveJournal accounts. It looks back on the online culture of the early 21st century and how we interacted with what we had. But as I said earlier, there's a slightly bitter, cynical edge to the game, and where it sometimes forays into deconstructive nostalgia. The core theme of the game is hopefully going to be disappointment. The main character you play, me as a teenager, is trapped in high school, trapped in a fashion rut, and trapped in a country at the bottom of the world. And although your computer, in theory, gives you the freedom of the internet, it also traps you as well. Online stores don't ship to New Zealand. The internet is slow or outright doesn't work. Your laptop is shitty and it can't run anything. Links are broken, loading is slow, and try as you might, you can't quite see through the hazy fog and grasp at something you're quite sure is exciting and will turn you into someone cool. The operating system's broken, decaying edges stop you from fully experiencing anything, even if you somehow escape. Of course, none of this is particularly realistic. The edges act more of a gating mechanism and as a good antidote to scope creep than reproductions of actual bugs and bottlenecks. But do we want authenticity in a game like this? Do we want the fantasy? Nostalgia and fantasy go hand in hand. When we picture the video games of our youth, or the consoles and computers we grew up playing on, or the childhood bedroom that we grew up in, we're indulging in a fantasy. Fantasy is idealized. It is the opposite side of the coin to reality and potential disillusionment. Indulging in a fantasy that is all-encompassing means walking a fine line between keeping the fantasy alive and being repulsed by its reality. The occasional error message or the hint of a glitch can give a fake operating system an exciting spark, but do too much of it and we risk frustration of reality surfacing. Any media set in a past time risks wearing out its welcome or creating friction between what we want to be true and what was true. And why do we love these fantasies so much? We indulge in nostalgic fantasies that reflect what we want to think of ourselves. They let us see ourselves as the effortlessly cool hacker. We can taste the tentative bravado of teenagerhood. Or we can be the kid who knows everything there is to know about 80s pop culture references and we can save the world. We can place ourselves in a more innocent time, an age of romance, or an age of chivalry, or an age of prosperity, whatever we feel like is lacking in our current lives. Nostalgic fantasies can be collective, and they can be shared by a generation or a particular social group, or they can be personal to just our own experiences, but they are something we all buy into. The nostalgic fantasies turn into power fantasies. The ghosts of the past and its ideals will always haunt us. Nostalgia is particularly powerful in that it's made up of everything we've half remembered and long forgotten. But when we use nostalgia in the art we make, we have a choice. We can hold on to the fantasy of the past and the power that it gives us, or we can embrace the pain that comes with facing up to reality. I hope that over the course of this talk, I've given you some ideas on how you might use nostalgia in your own work. Think about the 3 types of nostalgia in media: restorative and affirmative nostalgia, reflective and introspective nostalgia, and critical and deconstructive nostalgia. Wield them effectively and judiciously, and don't be afraid to mix them up. Think outside the box when it comes to creating nostalgia in your own work. Stylistic nostalgia and crafting nostalgia both have their own benefits and shortcomings and don't have to be mutually exclusive. And finally, think about what nostalgia says about you, your work, and your player. What ideals does it represent? What fantasies does it dance with? And what, if any, realities will it serve up? For those of you watching at home later, or for those of you who are very fast readers, here are some of my references for this talk and some places to start from if you want to read more about this topic. I will also turn this talk into a blog post at some point, so these will all be written down in deliciously clickable form. And if you want to know when that blog post goes up, then you can follow me on Twitter, where I also post work-in-progress tweets of the game and don't really say anything nearly as coherent as all of this. Distinguished guests, I hope it has been a joy to talk to you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this excellent conference.